indeed our conveners in earlier sessions have been very brief with introductions, and I'm not going to be long, but I'm going to say something about both of these speakers because they're people I've worked with so closely over a long period of time. First of all, Edward Town, who did his PhD on the early modern phase of Knoll, an AHRC-supported PhD with the National Trust. And then, since then, he has been a postdoctoral research assistant on the National Portrait Gallery's Making Art in Tudor Britain project, and next year is going to Yale as a visiting scholar, and we're about to see one of the fruits of his recent work, a gathering of completely new documentation and analysis on the artisans and craftsmen of Elizabethan Jacobean London, to be published by the Walpole Society, a massive new amount of work, which I'm sure we will all be using for decades to come. But today, he's going to talk about architecture, building, and technology after Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maurice. So today I've been asked to discuss Thomas Smith's legacy as an architectural patron and to proffer up some suggestions as to why other patrons chose not to follow the model he had set out through the creation of Hill Hall. Now, this is not necessarily a straightforward task, because as we know, it's very rare that we have a record of an Elizabethan patron articulating why he or she chose to build in a particular style. Even rarer, in fact, for them to state why they chose not to do something. Nevertheless, I'm going to use the time today interrogating the notion of Smith's Hill Hall being a singular house, this question of singularity. And in particular, I'm going to discuss the scheme of wall paintings undertaken as part of the remodelling of the north range of the house between 1568 and 9, which we heard about earlier. And I'm going to posit some possible candidates for the painters who may have been responsible for this phase of decoration. This is not with a mind towards detracting from the singularity of Smith's achievement, but is intended to situate Smith's work within the context of decorative painting in the first decade of Elizabeth's first reign. I would like to argue that although Smith's work at Hill Hall was almost certainly unique insofar as the patron himself orchestrated the iconographic scheme, the work itself belongs to a particular moment in the evolution of decorative painting in England. The leading exponents of this style in the early years of Elizabeth's first reign were London-based painters, familiar with continental print sources, as these paintings show, and to an extent continental painting techniques, but were still working within a traditional and native idiom. As Maurice mentioned, this paper comes off the back of research that I've undertaken for a biographical dictionary of London painters, which comprises of 848 biographies of painters active in London between the dates 1547 and 1625, and, as Maurice said, due for publication with the Walpole Society next year. For the most part, the research included in the dictionary has been derived from a thorough search of the documentary record, which, as we know, is often incredibly fragmentary. This is particularly the case for London craftsmen involved in the building trades. For example, there are no records of membership for all of the day-to-day activities for either the joiners' company, the masons' company, or the painter-stainers, let's get it right, prior to around 1620. So for the Elizabethan period, we really are in the dark on that front. As a result, we're reliant on other forms of documentation when attempting to reconstruct the careers of these craftsmen, many of whom were of relatively modest means. So although the dictionary doesn't provide the definitive account of each of these 848 painters, it's suitably comprehensive to allow us to profile some of the individuals that may have had a hand in the decoration at Hill Hall. Now, before embarking on a discussion of the wall paintings, I'd like to spend a moment considering the possibility of some form of meaningful interaction between Smith and another painter-stainer named John Shute. his name is familiar to many of you, as the author of the first and chief grounds of architecture, of which we see a page spread here. And obviously famous as the first architectural treatise published in Britain, in London. Although it was not published until 1563, which was the year of John Shute's death, it had been inspired by his journey in Italy in 1550, made at the behest of his patron, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and which included his stay in Rome. Shute returned to England with drawings from Italy, which were shown to Edward VI by Northumberland. As we know, by 1568, Shute's treatise sat on the same shelf in Smith's library, as editions of Vitruvius, Ducerceau, Delorme, and Hans Blum. Although Shute appears to have been Northumberland's rather than Somerset's man, it's difficult to imagine that Smith wasn't aware of his interests, as they were so close to his own. For one, Smith and Shute would have been near neighbours, at least when Smith lodged with his brother in Philpot Lane. And what you're looking at here is a map of London divided by parishes, and all 848 painters included in the dictionary mapped onto the city. And what's interesting to note is that where the parish in which John Shute lives, which is Edmund the King and Martyr on Lombard Street, isn't actually a parish that was particularly popular with painters, although it is sandwiched between this high density of painters, all leading along Fenchurch Street up towards Aldgate here. It's a plot off without Aldgate. Now Philpot Lane runs north-south, just next to St Edmund the King and Martyrs. So, yeah, as I said, at least when Smith was lodging with his brother, which he appears to have done quite regularly, he would have been in the vicinity of Shute and his studio in Grantham Lane in St Edmund the King and Martyr. Both Smith and Shute shared a mutual friend in the diplomat and author Daniel Rogers, who, in a series of undated laudatory verses, styled John Shute Britannia as his amico singulare. It's nice, this term singular coming up again here. Smith was also the subject of a number of epigrams written by Daniel Rogers in the same volume, and it's clear that both Shute and Smith were members of an intellectual circle which included a number of the leading humanists in Europe based in London. For example, the Ghent-born artist, poet, and elder of the Dutch Church, Lucas de Heer, to whom we will return to later. John Shute was probably born in Devon and can be identified as the Shute painter who, quote, gave a table of the Queen's Majesty's marriage to Mary I as a New Year's gift in 1556. I've mapped out a very brief biography here, which I'm going to paraphrase. So in 1561, he's paid £12 by the Merchant Tailors Company in London for the pageant for their Lord Mayor's show. And in the audit year 1561-2, the drapers paid him £4 for, quote, painting and gilding of the arms of England, new set in the hall. And what's interesting here is they make it very clear, they say done by John Shute, as I get the sense that they're not at all proud that they've got this successful painter to come and work at the company hall. He's almost certainly the limner, i.e. the miniaturist, named as Shute by Richard Haydock in his tract of The Arts of Curious Painting or Carving of 1598, which is the English translation of Lamatzo's treatise on painting. The verse epitaph on John Shute's monument, which was recorded prior to the destruction of the Church of St Edmund the King and Martyr in the Great Fire of London, celebrated his achievement in bringing knowledge of the, quote, ancient practice of architecture to England, to the benefit of, quote, the common weal, which is interesting. Given the fame that Shute enjoyed, both within his lifetime and after his death, it is possible, I would suggest, that he was the painter known simply as Master John in the accounts, responsible for portraits of Mary I of 1544, Catherine Parr, and Edward VI. He's only associated. he's associated with this picture on the grounds of technical similarities between this portrait and the previous two portraits I've shown you. So although no testimony or will for Shute has been traced, the administration of his estate was granted to his widow Helena at the Prerogative Court of Canterbury on the 11th of October 1568. Subsequent disputes between Shute's widow and her children regarding Shute's estate attest to his wealth, which at the time of his death was in excess of £300. It's important to stress this was an unusually large sum for an artisan of this period to accrue, and suggests that Shute was one of the most successful, if not the most successful painter of his generation, certainly as a native-born painter. So I pointed out the fact that Shute and Smith not only knew the same people and lived remarkably near to each other, but without further evidence, these links can only be suggestive of a possible exchange of ideas and knowledge between the two. Further to this, the early versions of Smith's portrait, made in the 1540s and replicated through the production of copies, of which we were looking at one here on canvas, do not appear to have anything in common with the works that I've shown you, those three works I've shown you attributed to Master John. At present, the identity of the artist responsible for the primary versions of this portrait type of Smith is not known, but it's tempting to suggest the name, albeit tentatively, of John Betts I, active as portraitist from the 1540s onwards, who is believed to be the artist responsible for painting the portrait of Sir William Butts, under whose patronage Smith first came to prominence at Cambridge. Whatever the case, both John Shute's death in 1563 and John Betts' death in either 1563 or 65, we're not sure, there are two entries in the parish register of St Martin in the Fields for Betts. The fact that both of these individuals were dead by 1568 precludes the possibility that they had any involvement in the decoration of the walls in the principal rooms following the reconstruction of the North Range of Hill Hall in 1568 to 69. One name that has been tentatively suggested in the past as the painter responsible for the decoration at Hill Hall was the aforementioned Lucas de Hare. De Hare was prescribed as a member of the Reformed religion in 1568 and moved with his wife to England that year. By 1571, De Hare was living in the parish of St Bennet Fink with his wife, a son who had been born in Ghent, and his servant John de Critz. This is John de Critz, the elder, who later goes on to serve as sergeant painter to James I. Works associated with De Hare during his time in England included a gallery decorated with depictions of costumes of various nations, which was made for the first Earl of Lincoln, probably his London house. A commission that almost certainly relates to a series of drawings of costumes worn in the British Isles, included in his Beschreibungen der British Islanden of 1573 to 75, of which there are two versions, one of which is at the British Library, and there's also the an expanded version of actually of slightly higher finish, which survives in the University Library at Ghent. And I've given references to both of these manuscripts here. As an aside, the British Library copy is currently on display at the Elizabeth and Her People show, the Elizabeth I show, at the National Portrait Gallery. So you can have a look at it in the flesh. As an elder in the Dutch Church, De Hare was a respected figure within the intellectual circles of Europe. And as I've mentioned, he's described by Daniel Rogers, an associate of Smith and Shute, as Lucas de Hare, Pictorius, the most famous painter in a laudatory poem of around 1569. While in England, Lucas de Hare also produced his Tableau Poétique, which we see a small reproduction of the first page of it here, dedicated to Edward Seymour, the first Earl of Hertford, dated to the 8th of January 1572/3, and includes, this is quite a substantial volume of poetic works in a private collection, which includes poems dedicated to the Earl of Hertford, obviously, to De Hare himself, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, to De Hare's own pupils, presumably John de Cretz, and to Robert Dudley, First Earl of Leicester, Francis Howard, Sir Thomas Gresham, and the Queen Elizabeth I. Towards the end of this volume of poetic works, there are a series of odes and anagrams on the names of his poems, on the names of his patrons, but at no point in this volume is Thomas Smith mentioned. So moving on, I'd like to suggest that even a cursory comparison between wall paintings at Hill Hall and either the Ghent or the British Library versions of the costumes would suggest that, notwithstanding the differences in scale and medium, the Hill Hall paintings could not have been painted by De Hare, as they show none of the sophistication or mastery of the human form that De Hare demonstrates in these works. As an alternative, I would endorse, I believe it's Tobit Curtis's suggestion that the wall paintings were undertaken by the workshop of a London painter stainer. Decorative painting of this type was once ubiquitous in the palaces and houses of the elite, but is incredibly rare to survive. Nevertheless, the materials and techniques employed at Hill Hall are consistent with contemporaneous examples that can be found at Much Hallam in Hertfordshire, which we see here, albeit in a slightly compromised state, and at Carpenter's Hall in London, which I'm going to go on to talk about in a second. This series of paintings, which includes some biblical scenes as well, which I'm unfortunately not able to show you, were almost certainly commissioned by the wealthy London mercer, Clement Noose, who his portrait, very fine portrait, adorns Tiny Cooper's recent publications of his portrait. As I will go on to discuss, the work at the Carpenter's Hall, as seen in these 19th century watercolours by John Wickham Archer, are not securely dated, but were almost certainly painted during the 1560s. Following the death of both Shute and Betts in the middle years of the 1560s, there were relatively few native painters of note or fame operating in London. However, there is one painter who enjoyed considerable success during the 1560s and early 1570s, and who was a possible candidate for the master of the workshop who worked at Hill Hall. This is the relatively unknown but extremely interesting painter called Richard Baker, active between 1550 until his death in 1575. And again here I've just mapped out a very brief biography for Richard Baker. In 1556, the same year that Shute presents Mary I with the picture, Richard Baker gives the Queen a table painted with a woman of Samaria, again as a New Year's gift. From then onwards, nothing is known of his activities until October 1566, when he was given the important contract of painting a pageant for the Ironmongers' Company. Again, this is a nice parallel here with Shute's activities, and shows that the London painter stainers are undertaking a variety of different work. But what's most interesting about Baker is that he holds important ties to both native and foreign painters. As we know, from around 1567 onwards, London received a huge influx of highly skilled migrants fleeing religious persecution from the Netherlands, and among their number are at least 35 painters who come from across Netherlands and set up shop in London. So Richard Baker is described as, quote, a good friend by the painter John de Frank, who is from Bruges and an important associate of Marcus Garrett the Elder in de Frank's will of 1570. And Baker was also bequeathed an unnamed picture in the will of Jacob Methusian in his will of 1570. Baker's dealings with the Dutch are also recorded in the minutes of the Consistory Court in July 1574, where his name appears as Richard Baker, schilder, painter. where at the time he was living in Long Lane, in Aldersgate. And as I mentioned, Baker dies in around 1575, unfortunately intestate. So what I'd like to draw your attention to in looking at this very brief plan of his life is the payments made in 1570 to 71 of 54 shillings, not an insubstantial sum, for, quote, making the story in the parlour at Carpenter's Hall. Part of this decorative scheme included carved crests, and given that there were no payments made for canvas alongside the payment for the painting, it's likely that Baker painted his story directly onto the plaster wall of the parlour at Carpenter's Hall. Normally, painters get remuneration for their materials, it's particularly canvas. Now this obviously makes him a likely candidate for the extant wall paintings at the Carpenter's Hall, which I showed you the drawings of just a moment ago, which, frustratingly, there are no payments that can be linked to directly. However, it is clear that there was a fashion for this form of story work, particularly amongst the leading livery companies of London during the 1560s. For example, in April 1563, the Bakers' Company paid two other London painters £10, 10 shillings for painting the canvas in the new parlour at Baker's Hall, and an additional 15 pence for two ells of canvas that wanted in and about the new parlour. It's important to stress here that these paintings, I know I'm talking about paintings on canvas rather than the paintings at Hill Hall that are on plaster, but these payments at Baker's Hall and elsewhere, the canvas is stretched onto battens, so it would have been flush to the wall and not hang like we might imagine as a tapestry. These are fixtures essentially to the room. And another example of many is an unnamed painter paid by the Clothworkers' Company for, quote, new painting 2 stories in the company hall. And it's important to stress that this fashion was relatively short-lived, and by the 1580s, the livery companies of London, who were presumably aping fashions at court, were no longer commissioning these large-scale narrative works, which were normally always at Cornice height in the fashion that we see in the Hezekiah paintings at Hill Hall in the study. And instead, they were focusing their resources on decorating their interiors with elaborately carved wainscot. But in the late 1560s, my argument is that the decoration of large friezes painted in situ, either on canvas or directly onto the plaster, was extremely popular. And one of the leading exponents of this form of decoration was the London painter stainer Richard Baker, a forward-thinking individual with important links to skilled Netherlandish artists. And now, presumably, his work would have been known to Smith through Richard Kirby, Smith's chief architect, an important member of the Carpenters' Company, who would have seen Baker's work in the parlour whenever he visited the company hall. He may even have recommended Baker to Smith. This is supposition, but it's a possibility. And until such time as technical comparison between the decoration at Carpenter's Hall and that at Hill was undertaken, it's impossible to prove anything. But whatever the case, I would argue strongly that Richard Baker was absolutely the type of individual that Smith or his deputies would have called on to undertake the work at Hill Hall. And in this respect, Smith's decoration of these rooms was in line with the prevailing fashions in London. Less a singular house, and more a singular survival from a defined period in the evolution of decorative painting in England. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is my colleague Andrew Hadfield, who is Professor of English at the University of Sussex. And speaking of the National Portrait Gallery exhibition, he has a contribution in that catalogue of that current exhibition there. But more importantly, very recently, Andrew's book on Edmund Spenser has really carved out a niche, as it were, as the primary biography and overview of the literary output of that great figure in our Elizabethan history. Today, he's going to talk about the impact of Thomas Smith as a kind of concluding paper to us all.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for that very kind introduction. I've enjoyed the last paper very much. It's always good when you come to these events and you learn something, so I've hastily crossed out one sentence that says I now realise it's completely wrong. And I've also gone for a rather larger PowerPoint than I normally do, thinking that as I was speaking at the Society of Antiquaries, I ought to try and impress you with how many sort of visual things that I can speak about. This paper is it's largely kind of based on my biography of Spencer, and it will suggest that Smith was a particularly influential figure in Elizabethan England because he served as an example of a public intellectual, one who influenced political life, shaped public culture in the arts and literature, had a sustained interest in advanced intellectual ideas from colonialism to house design, and who provided a model for upward mobility for aspiring young intellectuals, something that's particularly important. Perhaps Smith is actually the closest example we have to a Renaissance man, or at least that's how he was viewed by some of his contemporaries. In many ways, Smith might be likened to a figure such as Pietro Bembo, with his interests in the visual arts, publishing, poetry, scholarship, religion and public life, although I've yet to be able to find any evidence that Smith had an affair with anyone like Lucretia Borgia. But maybe there is some sort of secret waiting in the archives. Perhaps the most bizarre fact relating to Smith is that he and John Cheek, his collaborator on the reform of Greek pronunciation and English orthography, both suffered the loss of their sons in Ireland. And there'll be more on Smith Jr. later. But Cheek's son was the only English casualty at the massacre of Smeric in November 1580, killed when he unfortunately put his head up from the trench as he was in at the wrong time. Spencer was also present at that. But it's an interesting fact that the two of them had sons killed in Ireland. It gives you some sense of the range of Cheek and Smith's collaboration and the range of their kind of common interests. We can lose sight of the range of influence of figures like Smith because we want to categorise and place figures who resist modern ideas of specialism and do not fit easily into one category, or rather have a significant longer-term impact in one discipline, which is why Smith has largely disappeared from view to any but a small and select group of aficionados. There's another reason. Smith's main self-appointed disciple was Gabriel Harvey, 1552 to 1631. Intellectual, man of letters, teacher, scholar, heir of Cicero. But he's now best known to most people as a pedant and a bore, someone who was completely defeated in his protracted pamphlet war by the much more intellectually adept Thomas Nash. This has had a terrible effect, I think, not just on Harvey's reputation, but on the reputation of the kind of legacy of the people Harvey was looking up to, which is principally Sir Thomas Smith. I don't have time to go into this debate particularly today, but I can answer more about it later on. It's true that Nash does run rings round Harvey, and he writes in a far more witty manner than Harvey manages in this pamphlet war. But the truth is, he would have run rings around pretty much anybody writing in that period, and he was capable of making most clever people look absolutely stupid. Nash did not win every point, and just as Smith's importance can be obscured, so can Harvey's. Harvey was a brilliant man who wrote with a mixture of brio and pomposity, but his work had serious significance, as his disciple Edmund Spencer recognised. Harvey was the one main figure who took on board Smith's vision of the intellectual and passed it on to Spencer, and that, I think, is a crucial fact. The Bishop's Ban of 1599 silenced Harvey forever, even though Harvey was to live for another 30 years in Saffron Walden, practicing medicine and developing new strains of apples. This is the Dr. Harvey apple that Gabriel Harvey developed. And in case that action shot wasn't exciting enough, here's a second shot of the apple. Smith's particular influence ended too, as Harvey's enthusiastic public endorsement of his patron led ultimately to something of a dead end. And that's what I want to do in this paper, is perhaps pick up, analyse some of these dead ends and pick them up and see where they might be thought about. The story might help illustrate what was at stake in Harvey's endorsement of Smith, as well as Harvey's own abrasive character. Harvey's picture of Cambridge life in his published letters to Spencer, they published their own correspondence, a sign of their own sort of desire to be seen as serious intellectuals, perhaps something in the same vein as Cheek and Smith or Erasmus and his circle. This includes a vicious attack on Andrew Perne, 1519 to 89, master of Peterhouse, of whom we've already heard something. This is the first quotation on the handouts that have gone round. And when you will need to have my testimonial of your old controller's new behaviour, a busy and dizzy head, a brazen forehead, a leaden brain, a wooden wit, a copper face, a stony breast, a factious and elvish heart, a founder of novelties, confounder of his own, and his friends' good gifts, a morning bookworm, an afternoon maltworm, a right juggler as full of his sleights, wiles, fetches, carts of legerdemain, toys to mock apes with all odd shifts and knavish practices as his skin can hold. He often telleth me he loveth me as himself, but out, liar, out, thou liest abominably in thy throat. By the early years of Elizabeth's reign, Perne was notorious as a turncoat, changing his religion to ingratiate himself with each new regime and each new change in religious policy. That's probably a very harsh verdict on Perne, but that's the sort of verdict people like Harvey had. Perne was a powerful diplomatic figure who served his university very well through a period of sustained danger to its very existence. The qualities that Harvey lampooned were also those of a diplomat prepared to put the survival of the institution above the integrity of the individual. And that, I think, is what Harvey particularly objects to. Harvey sustained an unpleasant series of public quarrels with Perne, culminated in an unseemly dispute at Sir Thomas Smith's funeral about Harvey's acquisition of some manuscripts that had been in Smith's possession. Perne then successfully opposed Harvey's appointment as university orator in 1580 after Harvey had written to Lord Burleigh requesting the post. So this rivalry, I think, is very important between Perne and Harvey. And it's easy to see why Harvey and Perne disliked each other so much, and more was at stake in their quarrel than personal animosity. Harvey felt the university's success was limited and was eager to transform it in his own image. The struggle over the manuscripts at Smith's funeral is part of, I think, also of a fight over Smith's legacy, with Perne eager to co-opt him for an establishment tradition, whereas Harvey was concerned to have Smith as the champion of an alternative, public-focused academy beyond the university's hidebound and conservative educational ethos. This is something of an interesting dead end, where Harvey wants to sort of get rid of what he sees as the stultifying effects of Cambridge education and have a much more sort of open and pragmatic sense of the public intellectual. Both of them, I think, see themselves as the kind of proper heir of Sir Thomas Smith. Smith, the university man, is what Perne wants to co-opt. Smith, the kind of public servant, is what Harvey's interested in. Harvey hoped for a glittering academic career that would take him beyond the confines of the university and enable him to make his mark in the world of politics and at court, and he looked up to Smith as an intellectual mentor, a role Harvey wanted to play in turn for his student Edmund Spencer. Harvey corresponded extensively with Smith in the early 1570s, and Smith is cited in the Harvey-Spencer letters as an authority on orthography and prosody. Smith dedicated his Latin work on the pronunciation of Greek to Harvey in 1568. Harvey records in a letter to John Young, then Master of Pembroke, that he visited Smith at Hill Hall. Smith also had a large townhouse in Saffron Walden, almost next door to one of the properties owned by the Harvey family. This is, you've got to admire the photograph. I'm notoriously terrible at taking pictures. There are no, as you'll see, it is actually in focus more or less, and there's no thumbprint at the bottom, so I was quite pleased with that. Not much of Smith's house remains, but Martin Everett, who's an expert on Saffron Walden affairs, showed me around this and said this is a bit of Smith's townhouse that remains. As we've heard all today, Smith was an immensely important figure, was well known both for his kind of political work and his kind of role throughout the reigns of Edward VI and Elizabeth, and particularly for, as Anne McLaren was telling us, for De Republica Anglorum, which is something that both Harvey and Spencer pick up on. Spencer read De Republica Anglorum in manuscript undoubtedly at Harvey's bidding, and a commitment to the ideal of the sovereign only able to rule with the consent of Parliament is certainly evident in his later writings, indicating perhaps that Smith's ideas stayed with him throughout. The gloss to the word couth in Spencer's first publication, the poem The Shepherd's Calendar, links Smith and Harvey and informs the reader that the latter lent the writer the former's book. This is very important in the way Harvey and Spencer represent themselves, is this exchange of books. And I think I'm going to say a bit more about how I think that comes out. Smith is someone who promotes the idea of the library as a sort of central thing, and it's no accident that both Spencer and Harvey not only read a lot of books, but they talk about a lot of books publicly and how they exchange things and they write in books and give them to each other. There's a famous wager between the two that they talk about where Harvey's supposed to finish something by a certain point, and if not, he forfeits his Lucian. But what's important is the two kind of want to be seen to be publicly debating these things. Anyway, this is the next bit on the quotation is from the Shepherd's Calendar. Couth cometh of the verb con, that is to know or to have skill, as well interpreted the same worthy Sir Thomas Smith in his Book of Government, whereof I have a perfect copy in writing, lent me by his kinsman, and my very singular and good friend Mr. Gabriel Harvey, as also some of the other of the most grave and excellent writings. It's interesting that is placed there, this exchange of books from Smith to Harvey to Spencer is clearly situating himself as somebody in the intellectual tradition of those people. Of course, the notes in the calendar are attributed to the anonymous or the unknown E.K., but given Spencer's very public relationship with Harvey, this certainly suggests that Harvey wrote many, if not all of the notes, probably with the help of others. The note is a deliberate advertisement of the intimate intellectual circle around Smith, echoes of whose work have also been discovered in Spencer's view. A view of the present state of Ireland, that is, not published later on. Since Smith was one of the leading humanists of his generation, Harvey looked to emulate his career and establish himself as Smith's intellectual heir. Harvey was responsible for a series of Latin elegies composed after Smith's funeral, August 1577, which were published by Thomas Binneman in 1578, Smithus Lacrimae Muserum. And Binneman, there's a lot of common publication that takes place. Binneman also publishes work by Harvey and Spencer and by Smith, and it's kind of there's clearly connection between those things. Common links are made there as well. The other thing that I think was very important, as I said also, was the large library that Smith assembled in Hill Hall, which was certainly noted, was certainly catalogued, and it contained works on civil law, theology, mathematics, history, philosophy, medicine, literature, including not only classical texts but many contemporary works of topical interest, such as Castiglione's Book of the Courtier and Machiavelli's work. And this is something that I think is very important for both Spencer and Harvey, who I suspect have access to this and make use of this library. Also, I'm going to say a bit about the pictures that Edward analysed so carefully as well, because I think those are things that Spencer saw and probably had an influence on him. But most significant of all, Smith may have used Hill Hall as something approaching an alternative university, encouraging scholars to meet and discuss important issues and problems in order to advise politicians, the logical culmination of his attempts to marry intellectual and practical endeavour in line with the Aristotelian humanist ideal of combining the active and contemplative lives. One particular debate, which many of you will know, took place in late 1570 or early 1571, as Harvey recorded in his copy of Livy, using a reading of the historian of the Roman Republic to think about Elizabethan military strategy. And this is the next quotation. Thomas Smith Jr. and Sir Humphrey Gilbert debated for Marcellus, Thomas Smith Sr. and Dr. Walton Hammond for Fabius Maximus, before an audience at Hill Hall, consisting at that very time of myself, John Wood, and several others of gentle birth. At length the son and Sir Humphrey yielded to the distinguished secretary. Perhaps Marcellus yielded to Fabius, both of them worthy men and judicious. Marcellus the more powerful, Fabius the more cunning. Neither was the latter unprepared, meaning weak, nor the former imprudent. Each is indispensable as the other in his place. There are times when I would rather be Marcellus, times when Fabius. This has been quite well analysed, I won't say a lot about it. Something I'll flag up here that is very important is John Wood, who is Smith's nephew. Somebody, once Spencer gets married, there's a series of public letters between, it's acknowledged in the letters between Spencer and Harvey that Spencer's about to get married. Harvey's letter book shows that he started to cultivate John Wood as a kind of replacement Spencer figure. And clearly he was again sort of looking to go into the Smith circle and cement his kind of role as central to that particular intellectual role. Wood dies quite young, I think, and so it doesn't ever really go anywhere, or certainly the relationship with Harvey doesn't develop as it might have done. It's a further sign of how Harvey is looking at those Smith-Saffron-Walden connections. As Harvey's account demonstrates, the debate was designed to decide whether the ruthlessness of Marcellus or the more cautious strategy of Fabius was better suited for the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland. Harvey indicating that he, and presumably many others, felt that the conclusion was finely balanced. The debate in front of an audience of several others of gentle birth sounds very much like the sort of formal public exercises that students had to go in order to complete their degrees, further suggesting that Harvey and Smith saw events at Hill Hall playing a crucial role in bridging the gap between the university and public life. We don't know whether this was one of a number of experiments, or whether it just was a one-off that never got developed. Gilbert had already made a name for himself as a ruthless exponent of martial law when military governor of Munster in late 1569, suppressing the Fitzgerald uprising and forcing those chief Irish lords who submitted to him to approach him through a lane of severed heads on poles, according to Thomas Churchyard, a loyal soldier under Gilbert in the 1560s and 1570s. Gilbert was also a keen advocate of the sort of educational reforms favoured by Smith, and wrote a short treatise about this at this time, the erection of an academy in London for education of Her Majesty's wards and others, the youth of nobility and gentlemen, with another tract arguing the case that academies that bridged the gap between tertiary education and public life, especially in military matters, were extremely useful. You get a sense of more people within the circle thinking the same kind of thing. The immediate purpose of the debate at Hill Hall was a practical one. It was to prepare Sir Thomas Smith's illegitimate son, also called Thomas, for his military expedition to Ireland to colonise the Ards Peninsula, the first stage of Smith's attempt to use the help of intellectuals to transform Ireland from the most rebellious and lawless of the Queen's dominions to an ordered and settled society. Smith published a pamphlet, a letter sent by J.B. Gentleman unto his very friend Master Robert R.C. Esquire, wherein is contained a large discourse of the peopling and inhabiting the country called the Ards, and other adjacent in the north of Ireland, and taken in hand by Sir Thomas Smith, one of Her Majesty's Privy Council, and Thomas Smith Esquire, his son. Clearly written in the wake of the Hill Hall debates, there's a direct link between those two texts. The pamphlet was also published by Binneman, which proves yet another link between Harvey, Spencer, and Smith. The pamphlet has a practical but seriously informed approach to colonisation, giving details of how much land each settler will need, what they should grow, how they need to protect themselves, and how they can rely on the native Irish churls to work for them, which will in fact lead to a problem. This is a quote from it, but not on the sheet. But I fear the sweetness which the owner shall find in the Irish churl, giving excessively, will hinder the country much in the peopling of it with the English nation, making men negligent to provide English farmers. Sadly and unsurprisingly, this optimistic assessment proved unfounded, and the expedition ended in total disaster with the death of Smith Jr., his boiled carcass fed to the dogs by his Irish killers, according to Thomas Churchyard. Now, there's either a kind of an amazing coincidence here, or as part of a plan that Spencer ends up in Ireland. So Smith is someone who's very keen to promote Irish colonialism in the 1570s. Edmund Spencer goes over in 1580 and remains there for the rest of his life, becoming a colonist in Ireland. There's a movement westwards by a lot of these people who are very interested in the practical issues of colonialism. And I think that's something that stems out of Smith's influence as a particularly sort of practical intellectual who wants to influence public affairs. Harvey's negative reputation in Cambridge helps to confirm the suspicion that he was really more committed to the circle around Sir Thomas Smith than to his college. Smith's public relationship with John Cheek, in which the two sought to represent the interests of Cambridge to the court, appears to have been one that Harvey hoped to emulate in his relationship with Spencer, notably through the audacious act of publishing their correspondence in 1580. There's a sense in which they published these letters between them in 1580, and the arrogant sense is very much that you'll learn more from reading these letters from these two educated humanists than you will studying for years and years in Cambridge, really. Because they can kind of discuss anything and everything, really. By then, Harvey had already positioned himself as the intellectual heir of Smith, asking Smith's advice about the value of civil law, then studying for a Doctor of Laws around the time of Smith's death, perhaps a symbolic act of intellectual patrilineage. Harvey, in Letters to Spencer, caricatures the efforts of current undergraduates. This is, I think, the last quotation. Much verbal and sophistical jangling, little subtlety and effectical disputing, noble and royal eloquence, the best and persuader's eloquence. No such orators again as red-headed angles, an exceedingly great difference between the countenances and ports of those that are brave and gallant, and of those that are basely or meanly apparelled, between the learned and unlearned, Tully and Tom Tooley, in effect none at all. This needs some explanation. In effect, Harvey is lamenting the failure of the university to listen to him and to organise teaching according to his ideas. Instead, students have the appearance of learning without the substance, the tricks of the trade without the knowledge that these tools are supposed to provide. Students look like they are arguing, but they are not, because they dismiss real debate as that of conceited superficial fellows. The attacks on Xenophon and Plato that he describes indicate that in Harvey's mind he has become the true heir of Greek scholarship, the intellectual son of Sir Thomas Smith, a sly reference surely designed for Spencer to enjoy. The students, meanwhile, have declined under the foolish charge of the Cambridge authorities, becoming red-headed angles rather than skilled orators. The reference is to the story of St. Augustine of Canterbury, the missionary sent over to convert the Anglo-Saxons by Pope Gregory, on being told that the golden-haired English boys in the Roman marketplace were angles, quipped that they should be called angels, not angles. Harvey uses the story to indicate that Cambridge has turned the clock back and transformed its once brilliant students like Spencer into ignorant English boys who cannot see the real value of reading Plato and Xenophon in Greek. So I think that's a very pointed reference. He's saying, I'm the person who kind of really knows about Greek, and it's a real bitter attack on the authorities for not recognising that. Some of Smith's legacy undoubtedly rubbed off more directly on Spencer as well as Harvey. Immediately after leaving Cambridge, Spencer probably spent a great deal of time with Harvey, as the close friendship advertised in the letters suggests. It's most likely that, at least intermittently, Spencer lived with Harvey in Saffron Walden, where the family owned a number of houses, as well as in the nearby village of Wimbush. John Harvey, Gabriel's father, had risen to prominence in the town as a prosperous road maker and became the treasurer of the council. The most likely location where they lived is a substantial townhouse in what is now Market Street, which later became a pub, the Bell, although Harvey could have lived in another house in Gold, formerly Gow Street. Well, that's Thomas Smith's, that's Hill Hall, of course. I thought I'd include this because I got roundly told off. It's a laundry now, I think, and when I was I forgot to ask permission, and the lady came out sort of shouting at me while I was taking photographs, but eventually realised that they weren't for any sort of terribly nefarious purpose. So Thomas Smith's house in the town was. Have I got the other one? No, that's the fireplace. I'll leave it on that for now. So Thomas Smith's house in the town was only 2 doors away on the main square. That's not that house, it's another one, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I've mixed those two up. The Harvey house was demolished in the 19th century to make way for a cattle market before a building belonging to the Saffron Walden Building Society was erected on the site. There is this is what I'm interested in. There's a splendid fireplace with a mantelpiece. There is a splendid fireplace with a mantelpiece displaying the art of rope making, which was removed from this property, but which is now in the town museum. Why is that? Can I?
Click on the left side rather than the right side.
I've gone back, and now I can do that. Okay, thanks. Sorry. This is really interesting. This fireplace. This is something that Harvey either had himself or commissioned for his father. And it shows the art of rope making. And what I want to say is, I think there's a Smith influence on this as well. In that one of the things I said that was very important, that I think other people picked up on with Smith, was the idea that he was a self-made man. He'd risen through the ranks, and I think many people like Harvey and Spencer, who were not from particularly exalted backgrounds, felt a fierce determination to kind of rise and become influential and important figures. That's something that really drives Harvey forward. And I think Smith, that's why Smith is such a good example for them. But this fireplace, which is quite an elaborate thing in the Saffron Walden Museum, it's a splendid combination of classical learned references and the virtues of kind of good, honest English work. And it combines a sort of sense of Harvey's own origins as the son of a rope maker, a successful rope maker, and his great classical learning in having all these kind of emblems around it. And I think very much it's in the tradition of the decorative arts that he would have seen at Smith's house, which are also kind of elaborate for English houses of that period. But also, this is giving a sense of kind of rising through work. There's another bit with this beekeeping, Virgilian stuff. You can't photograph easily because there's something in there's a sort of board in the way that doesn't allow you to do it easily. And that's the other side of it. But I think it's worth seeing that in terms of the way that Harvey is thinking about his relationship with Smith. And it's very likely, I think, that Spencer would have met with Smith as well at the same time, if they were living in as he was probably living in Saffron Walden a lot. Either would see Smith or have some connection with Smith at his house, or would travel to Hill Hall. So I want to conclude really by talking about the paintings which Edward started talking about. So these paintings were ambitious sequences which were unique in England in the 1560s and 1570s, and they probably had a considerable impact on Spencer, who, as many people have noted, was the most visual of all English poets, who had no opportunity to see any Renaissance art outside the British Isles, although he would undoubtedly have seen wall paintings which appear in the Dryden's house in Canons Ashby, where Spencer's from. Smith had a series of wall paintings and painted glass panels erected in 1568-9 with allegorical Protestant scenes. The paintings preserved represent a variety of allegorical themes. One sequence tells the story of Cupid and Psyche. Have I got? No, that's Hezekiah. That's the. It's more. These are. That's the Cupid and Psyche one. Who overcame the jealous tyranny of Cupid's mother Venus to marry. A common theme in Renaissance literature, a work that demonstrates Smith's interest in Neoplatonism. Another narrates the story of King Hezekiah. Let's go back. Is it going to let me go back?
Use the left arrow on the keyboard.
Previous, I just have to press previous, don't I? That's from the Hezekiah sequence. Okay. The religious reformer who helped unite the Israelites and who resisted the Assyrian tyrant, as well as a figure of magnanimity, part of a long-lost sequence on the cardinal virtues. Now, how did I conclude that? There's, sorry, I need to go to, it's going to let me do it. Okay, I'll just leave it on that. The Fairy Queen also tells the story of Cupid and Psyche, who produce a daughter of pleasure, and it has a number of key moments relying on the impact of carefully coded, lavish visual material, often representing astonished figures who enter grand halls covered with a variety of pictures, notably in the House of Pride, a Crazier's Bower, the Garden of Adonis, and the Castle of Bussyrain, which are the most obvious examples. Furthermore, the poem includes a mask of the 7 deadly sins who are paraded in the House of Pride. These are largely passages from sections of the poem that Spencer was probably working on relatively early in the poem's history, and may well have been influenced by what he saw at Hill Hall, which would have been the most spectacular visual encounter of his early life, I think. I can't, in a way, this section can't but be speculative, but it's hard to imagine that someone like Spencer didn't see these pictures, given the number of connections that turn up with him, between him and Harvey, and who talks about going to Hill Hall. Spencer may well have been present at that debate that was talked about as Harvey's kind of favourite pupil. And someone who kind of seems to have connections to Smith. I can't believe that he didn't actually see them. But, and for someone who makes such a big deal of visual culture in his work, it's unlikely that these didn't have some kind of impact on him. But I'll conclude. There is perhaps an irony, or rather a displaced understanding of influence that has obscured both Smith and Harvey and canonised Spencer. There's a grudging respect for Harvey as Spencer's mentor, but in many ways a disappointment that it wasn't somebody like Nash who moulded Spencer or who was his best friend. So there's something of an embarrassment of Harvey being Spencer's kind of mentor, really. Harvey, a figure who has not been treated well by posterity, has become something of an embarrassment, the man whose influence needs to be reduced and circumscribed. In doing so, the fertile intellectual legacy of Sir Thomas Smith has been obscured from view, making him a footnote when he should be seen as a figure whose achievement in adapting French style, the visual arts, promoting colonial ventures, and thinking about a more rounded and directly relevant understanding of education was a central factor in the transfer and development of the Renaissance in England. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think we could start with some specific questions to our last two speakers. The mic is on. Thank you. Any questions, please, for Edward or for Andrew? Nick.
I'd just like to ask Edward about, it's often pointed out the very great difference between the Hadfield cycling, the whole series which covers covered extensive parts of the house, and the Hezekiah room itself, and whether they might in fact be like different artists or master artists or
my understanding from reading the report and the publications that there was enough consistency in materials to suggest that this is one workshop with a degree of delegation across the workshop. That's what I thought. But I think it's looking at the two schemes that you do see differences. You know, the Cuban cycle was a lot more linear, and there seems to be a tonality in the Hezekiah series. But from what I've gathered from reading the report, there's enough continuity to suggest at least one overarching mind orchestrating the scheme.
Yes.
Edward, are you saying that the wall paintings and Carpenter's Hall are still there?
They are. I'm sorry, I'm actually
but
them themselves.
It's not a 16th century hall, so if they were wall paintings, how have they survived?
I do not know. They are in situ, sort of. They are raised frieze. They're very much still.
Thank you. I'll go and have a look at them. Thank you.
Claire?
I was just going to say the answer to that is that they were discovered in the 19th century where they had been covered over. They've then been lifted off on the plaster. The Noah's Ark one was lost, but fortunately the watercolours that were made are full size and they have those and two of the other paintings still.
Thank you.
So they are detached fragments of the 16th century scheme. Okay, more questions, please. Yes, Jean.
What impact do you, I think you talk about the theoretical impact of Hill Hall on Spencer, but then the examples you cite of interior decorative schemes appearing in the Fairy Queen are almost all in bad places, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, that's a very good question. Well, I don't know how much I want to make of that. I think one of the things I was concerned about in talking about this was that it's a cliche that Spencer has this very visual imagination, and yet he doesn't go outside. He goes outside British Isles and Ireland. He doesn't ever travel. And I started to try and find out what access people would have had to pictures and what they would have seen. And it's quite hard to decode that sort of information. You realise that the Earl of Leicester had a lot of pictures. That's one obvious source, and Spencer does stay in Leicester House at some point. He does seem to go to places where there are a lot of pictures. I just think that probably the first spectacular amount of pictures that he's going to see are probably the ones in in Hill Hall. You're right, they do all appear to be kind of bad negative examples, but that's because there are so many bad negative examples of kind of delusive visual imagination in the Fairy Queen. You know, there's obviously one of the things that he has terrible anxieties about, I think, is iconoclasm, and I think far fewer people were as enthusiastic about iconoclasm as people once suggested. I think an awful lot of people are very anxious about the malign effects of the visual, or the kind of complicated effects of the visual, which can imprint things in your mind that you don't really want imprinted there. And I think that's what he's really, really interested in, is the transfer, the direct experience of the visual. And I think that's where his kind of thinking in the poetry is going. I think from that there are more negative examples. I mean, it might be, had he lived to write more than the 6 books, then there would be more positive things turning up at the end. But obviously the nature of the narrative is that most visuals are not going to be wholly good, because they're testing people on their journey towards revelation.
Yes, Andrew.
Is the more or less total absence of images and portraits of Smith to be explained by the fact that his reputation was eclipsed so soon?
Yes. I don't know. He does seem to drop off the intellectual map, and I find it odd, really, that he does. I mean, it's partly. Spencer has a particularly ambiguous relationship, reputation in the 17th century, where he gets associated with certain kind of advanced Protestant factions, and I think there's a point at which any connection he has to that group of Elizabethan intellectuals is obscured after a certain point. I don't think, if you were to choose one person you wouldn't really want as your enthusiastic sort of disciple, Gabriel Harvey is probably that person. He clearly does. Although Harvey has numerous merits, but people don't like him very much. That's the trouble. And he sort of is one of those people who speaks endlessly about, you know, influencing the public, getting involved in sort of debates, but very much plows his own furrow, you know, after a certain point. Yes, I think there is a strange kind of disappearance of Smith at a certain point, where he's too much associated with earlier incarnations of things happening, and that legacy doesn't kind of get carried on for some reason. There's a missing link, I think, that means that it goes. But yeah, I think the book is wrong.
If I can follow up, or perhaps follow it down, I think what is an explanation for the absence of images during his lifetime?
Do you want to give
Having spent, no more than 20 minutes at the Heinz Archive National Portrait Gallery, we could go through Smith's sitter box, all of the known likeness. There are a number of pictures, found pictures of Smith, and large, full-scale canvas copies after the originals of the 1540s would suggest there was a small but perhaps significant demand for his portrait throughout the 16th and 17th century. So I would go again to say that there are, very, very few pictures. There are some somewhere.
I think that what Andrew, let me take Andrew's thing a stage further, is I suppose we're saying that, and only a few of them do, that he doesn't become, unlike particularly Cecil, part of sets of portraits of worthies in the late 16th century, early 17th century, as we have a 16th century set here of medieval kings, that they're putting them in that sequence alongside the great figures of Elizabeth's court, despite his having written a book which gained a lot of fame and notoriety in its time. Is that we don't have that repeated image of him, I suppose, is what we may be getting at there. And we're therefore unfamiliar with that image, whereas we'd all recognise Burghley because we've seen that copy after copy after copy in so many country houses. Any more direct questions specifically to our speakers and the content of their paper before I move us on? Because I've got a burning question for our general thoughts here to get us starting to talk in a minute. Which is, is there anyone else? Yes, Kat.
I wonder, Andrew, if you could talk a little bit about the idea of a professional reader in this way, around Hill Hall debates, like what's going on here, this sort of notion of audience, and perhaps the effect and how people read differently to the way we necessarily think about reading out loud or whatever.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, the thing with the Hill Hall debates is you can kind of, it might have been a one-off. It might have been planned as something much grander than ever took off. But I think what's interesting to me is where it's the context out of which it seems to emerge. In terms of shared reading, there's an awful lot of evidence now that people are looking at in books which suggest that the annotations in them are often designed so that more than one person reads them, and you go through them together and you look at things and you kind of look at key passages. And an awful lot of books where annotations survive, that seems what maybe what Smith's doing in the annotations that Richard was talking about, was marking passages that he was going to discuss with other people. Certainly the Game of Life You Live In looks like it's designed for kind of reading together and somebody kind of pointing this stuff out. There's a famous example of the Earl of Essex who gets, it's pointed out in his trial that he's had a lot of Roman Republican writings read to him by, what's his name, the religious professor of Greek who gets executed with him. The name will come back to me as soon as I finish doing this, but that's part of the evidence of the trial, is that they are reading literature together, which is kind of counted as potentially subversive. Ben Jonson talks about doing this when inviting a friend to supper, where he talks about getting his man to read out Livy and bits of Roman Republican writings and saying, no one will be hearing us here. We can say what we like about it, which provides some evidence that people are kind of reading books together, stopping, thinking about things. That's what a lot of the annotation seems to suggest. And Smith seems to be someone, as far as I'm concerned, who probably is pretty interested in those kind of practices. That's where a lot of research on reading is going about not just about people underlining their favourite passages and showing somebody else what they are, but then probably underlining them and then debating them, which is what the Hill debate also suggests people doing.
I think it is interesting because there's been a certain amount of work done on the other side of this idea that people, and particularly architects, and particularly Inigo Jaliman's, I'm thinking of Christy Anderson's work on his library at Worcester, is this idea that somebody who's thinking of rethinking architecture, and we can show him doing that over a long period of time, is doing these complicated annotations to take himself back through his library at different stages and different commissions. But that's very interesting what you're saying, and I think I've always assumed this is about a annotating process, because you want to know your library and what's important and what you need to come back to, and you think differently about Palladio, in 1635 than you thought in 1615. But this idea that you actually do it for a group of scholars around you to read the right things or things to mark for the next discussion amongst you is very interesting. I certainly wasn't aware of that kind of practice amongst these books and bringing groups of scholars together.
Well, I think if you think also the way that Harvey and Spencer make a big deal out of the exchange and sharing of books, there's definitely an attempt to represent books as something that bind this culture together as things that they read. I just wonder whether if one dug around more, you might find that Smith is the person who definitely ends doing that, given his own library. But the evidence of people lending books out of libraries is kind of sketchy. It does seem to happen, I think.
Yes. Okay, let me just, we'll talk for as long as we feel we need to, and we can't have a round table, which is in here, though I think Richard was thinking of that as a metaphorical sense. It's very difficult, and I don't want to call all the speakers up to take chairs up and sit round and then we talk for 8 minutes and that. But you may have particular questions to revisit to those speakers about what we've heard in the light of today's conversations. The big issue, it seems to me, as I'm sitting here thinking, having met so many of you before, gone around the building with Paul many 30 years ago, and then again later on, is in revisiting, rethinking this, You said, Andrew, that Smith is both a public intellectual and a public servant. What comes first? What motivates him? Does the fact that he's, carrying weighty office make him think about forms of government from his experience, or is he so interested in the politics, in his knowledge of Venice, for example, and the way it runs constitutionally, that is something to look up to, as many people felt at this time in England, that's the sort of thing which inspires him to go into public service to make some of those things happen. I just wonder if it is a question that one of these factors, amongst all the other things he's interested in, really prompts the other. And I'm not throwing that back at Andrew, I'm throwing it out to the floor.
I'd like to bring up in response to that, there's a moment where he is trying to talk about ceasing debasement and kind of restoring the coin. And it is incredibly unpopular with the government at the time. And it's what actually results in him being forced to kind of leave court in the first stage that he does, and sort of return to eating and things. So I think there's a moment where his knowledge of public intellectual and his sense of duty to act and advise the government, even if they don't want to hear it, actually incapacitates his ability to act and wield power. So I think the intellectual sometimes override the politician because he can't quite stop saying what he knows to be the truth.
Yes. I think it's just this idea that we often have, that people do these things in their retirement. They retire to their house and think about, what they've done, or they maybe write about it, which is a kind of cliche way of looking at it. Here we have an example of a man in which the two are enmeshed. They're intertwined through his life, that there is a degree of public service. He goes back to revisit some of these big jobs, and he's interested in colonialism and all these things, but also is thinking about these intellectual debates about what government is for, what it's supposed to do, and who wields power in the country.
Could I comment on that, Morris? I think, in a way, what's been coming out very
what's been coming out very strong indeed. I think Wheeler made the point that, rather like Bacon, over the period when they were out of office, they were doing a lot of investigation. I think two parallel things at least are going on. I mean, many parallel things are going on, but at least two, it seems to me. One is this extraordinary determination to investigate either through the reading of text, the annotation of text, which actually Andrew was commenting on. You're quite right, actually. He actually talks about his annotations, and I was talking about as something that his students could look at. So there is a sense that they're not just requirements. But he's not only investigating through text, he's also investigating through physical objects. And those physical objects have also been investigated through processes of experiment. And that seems to me to be something that is a really remarkable theme that has come out today. Experiments that we identified in the natural philosophy and in medical chemistry, things like that, but also the things that Paul was exploring, that House has an experiment, which I think is quite extraordinary. And those are the things where he is actually directly intervening and doing something himself. Then there are the other things, the discourse on the common wheel, which we haven't actually talk about today, on the way to the Roman foot soldier, the marriage debate, the marriage dialogues, and the day report around Laura, where it seems that he's actually using the writing in order to influence or develop, or perhaps also to explore. So I don't know that some of the documentation which we read as finished, we've also heard that a number of documents seem to have been developed, whether it was the letter that Carlotta was so interestingly explored as having perhaps been originally written in 1542, but then reworked for publication. So we're actually seeing various forms of investigation, some of them experimental, and some of them intending to have a
larger outcome, but some of them actually being explorations to find out about something. It seems to me that there's a whole series of interlocking processes which we can't actually or shouldn't reduce from that necessary complexity.
Okay. Someone at the back, okay, please.
I've been listening all day, expecting to hear people talk about the common weal with the last two people you mentioned. It comes, as it were, written just for a moment at the end of his time in office. He talks about debasement and partially, going back to sound money is not a people. It's the Warwick Northumberland people who go back really rather badly to sound money. What he suggests in the Commonweal, if I remember rightly, is taking advantage of prices abroad, the prices of imports being high, by import substitution. And it's just at that moment when he is writing, and I have no idea whether it's just at that moment because other people are thinking this as an ordinary thing, or because they have been reading what he writes, that import substitution begins. We stop, we reduce our purchases of Swedish and Spanish iron and develop our own iron. We try to cut back on our linen imports by growing more flax. We grow more wool, more madder. We try to do silk, it doesn't work. But a whole range of things that he suggests happen to actually be happening. Does anybody know whether there are any real connections between what he writes and what happens?
So do we have any historians of the early modern economy who know a bit more than all of us know a certain amount to start a lecture off or whatever about those connections? Because that is very interesting, and I'm just thinking there, about the concatenation there of traditional growing substances or things you make which maybe there's a need to return to, but also new possible industries like silk to get things off the ground and new European and economically beneficial. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that.
An example related.
Sorry, you need the microphone to just help us all.
Related to the chemical story about the patent for producing copper out of raw iron is that in fact the ordinary way of doing it was with the chemical reaction with vitriolic acid, sulfuric acid, and at the time you couldn't do it in England. You had to import vitriol and sulfuric acid from Europe, especially Germany. Germany, they were very advanced in metallurgic knowledge. So the interest behind this project, which in the end built actually was a sort of ill-devised scheme, was just to produce copper in England through the use of what they were called at the time earths, which means sort of pure, solid mineral that can activate a reaction. And actually, Thomas Smith wasn't really convinced about this, really. I mean, he was very skeptical. They keep paying the person who was saying he could do it. But what again is significant, I think, behind this is the economic interest that was possible to produce copper, which was very important also for artillery, for war, for other things, also for producing textile apparatuses, to produce it in situ, in England, and not importing through the process of the vitriolic acid. So behind many of those funny alchemical stories, there are actually indeed very concrete cases. This is just one, I think, that is connected to.
Can I just have a very quick point? I know there's a lot of effort to export crops or to start growing woad and madder in Ireland. It's seen as a kind of as a potentially very valuable crop. I don't think you can necessarily say that comes from what Smith's saying. I think what Smith is saying is what is perhaps current economic wisdom, and these are the crops you should be encouraging, because I think there are other people, Thomas Payne, the person I know in Nottinghamshire, who's very interested in exporting a lot of these crops to grow in Ireland, and I think it's all part of a general sense that's what you should be doing.
As an aside, as well, one of the byproducts from growing woad is something called florey, or Essex florey. It's scum from a process, which is used by painters. It's an alternative to ink. It's very popular. It ends up on
Lucy, you wanted to say something?
Yes. I'll probably regret this, but still, I'll have a go. Is it working?
It's on. Speak directly into it.
Like that? Right. I want to go back to your point about how do we get together.
Testing.
Okay.
Yes. I want to go back to your point, Richard, about how do we get together in our minds, the public servant and the intellectual. And it just occurs to me that there is at least one example across the channel, and that is Daniel A. Barbaroux, who produced a succession of intellectual works, like a commentary on his uncle's Latin translation of Aristotle's Rhetoric. He produced a treatise on eloquence, but there was also a practical streak through his work for Venice, and he was sent to superintend the creation of the Botanic Garden at Padua. And as time goes on, as far as I can see, there continues in Barbaroux this combination of the intellectual and the practical, which you can get through his commentaries on Vitruvius. But perhaps the point is that from November 1549 to April 1551, Barbaroux was in England, where he would have met members of the Privy Council, and he met the Seymour Circle, and he would have met Sir Thomas Smith. So, I mean, actually, it was quite an inspiring example. And I don't suppose that Barbaroux, although he was a diplomat, travelled around in a sort of Pope-mobile. I mean, he obviously had contact with people in England, because his instructions were to be active in appropriate circles in England.
Right, yes, I think that's a very interesting informative example. And I think there's another example of trade in Rome as well.
Yes.
I think we again mentioned this cross-fertilizing sort of fundamental training, which was in public office, public activity, but based in these intellectual processes, which nonetheless are going to have practical public benefit.
Yes, and also private benefit. Hall was a private benefit.
Andrew again. Thanks.
On this one.
Was the batteries on the second one?
No, I turned it off.
You turned it off. I was shy. I was shy. On that point, is there, I don't know,
there's no suggestion that he's using classical parallels under these, thinking in terms of Platonic guardians or someone like Cicero combining a sort of philosopher with a statesman. It's another example of how he knows about the classical past but doesn't really apply it to his own case.
Just one other point, just to take us back to the public the intellectual and the servant. It was very interesting with Ed's evidence here of this kind of work and probably a lot of actual painting on plaster happening in public buildings. We don't happen to have, in any of our grand houses at this period, wall paintings like Hill Hall. I mean, there's just nothing like it. This is a man of the rank and status who would have brought tapestry. And of course, interestingly here, tapestry is mimicked in one of the rooms by having a turned corner. Is that if this is, to follow up on Edward's point, if this is the way of painting stories for public places where, and we've obviously got a lot of evidence, we've lost a lot of evidence from Northern Europe from the 15th, 16th centuries, but we have quite a lot of evidence from 17th century Holland, all the great encomiums to behave well painted for the Amsterdam Town Hall and other places in 17th century Holland, that you put up public stories to inspire people to act well. It's very interesting that this is going on in London public spaces, for places like livery companies where you're meant to look after your fellows and be trade unionised and whatever, like the Square in Venice. You go and then do that in your house, or he does it in his house, to have wall paintings, which is the mode of, if everybody's right, is the mode of the moment. It's not a very long time that these are happening in company halls. That's very interesting about his transplanting this public role and what you do as a public servant into the house where his library is and where his groups of scholars are going to gather. Now you do.
Yes, I think that's assuming, I think that's making a number of assumptions. Let's recollect your original comment, Maris, about Hill Hall as the English Egmont.
Yes.
In Egmont we have wall paintings, trompe-l'oeil wall paintings in private spaces done for a grand patron. It seems to me that these are at least aspirationally about that. Whether they were carried out by people who had done other public painting seems to me to be an altogether another matter. Certainly when I originally proposed Lucas de Heer as the sort of painter who could have assembled, actually in particular Hezekiah drawings. I think it is very important that there is a very fundamental difference between the Hezekiah sequence and the Cupid Psyche sequence. The Cupid Psyche sequence is a very straightforward transfer from engravings to a very much larger realization in colour. But the linearity of the paintings is actually based on the linearity of the engravings. The Hezekiah sequence is quite different. It is in at least one scene based on an engraving. Now it's a, what is it, 2 or 3 metre scale. The woodcut, which I've identified as the source of that, is 60 millimetres. So we're talking about a much more, a very different thing in the use of that one woodcut, but we're also talking about at least 3 other paintings which are not necessarily based on a model at all. They've actually been composed. Where they were composed, how they were composed is another matter, but they're not straightforward transfers. So I think there is something fundamentally different there. But I think the idea is very interesting that Edward is finding these other people who could have done the work, because that seems to be something we need to find. But I'm not sure that actually influences the content style, the iconography, or the objective of the 2 sequences.
Yes. I suppose what I'm curious about is this sense of this is a house, therefore, which betokens a kind of luxury, floor tiles and whatever, but it's not I mean, I will say that Sands at the Vine was importing, was having Flemish glass and the latest tiles, and these were specific objects of luxury that an early Tudor courtier brings together because they betoken fashion. And there's very little evidence that he thought about what he was doing, as many other people were picking on these things as items of modern fashion. But here, from all that you said in the context that Paul gave in the book, this is a very particular view of doing luxury, some of it done in ways which are illusionistically amazing, and in some cases the actual substances themselves are very expensive to make. So I'm trying to get towards what kind of luxury is it?
I think the idea of luxury is very interesting. We remember that if he was the author of the Discourse of the Commonweal, he's extremely critical of spending too much money on luxurious decoration in your house. There's also another very interesting point on the Roman law, actually, which is that if you have to, the cost of damage is based on ordinary work, it's not based on very posh work. So there's all sorts of ethical issues about not having something too luxurious. I think this is actually much more intellectual and ethical in its ambition than luxurious in its ambition. Certainly what the Cuban Science story is about is an ethical transformational concern with the nature of the human soul. Hezekiah one clearly has references to his political engagement with the Reformation. I think the use of the tiles, I'm not sure that those tiles were particularly luxurious. They're very interesting, they're important in their expression of the virtues, just as the glass painting, which actually is the Seven Deadly Sins, very interesting in Spencer's terms, that perhaps was a bit more expensive, but again that's based on very directly on engravings. So I'm not sure that it is about luxury. I also suspect that, I think this is the point Paul was making about getting the house built for Elizabeth to visit it. I suspect that the reason that it's painted is perhaps it was quicker to do, and that you could get it done in time for this potential visitor.
What would you want to do?
Come in briefly on that, because the paintings are based on engravings that the client had, which is not particularly unusual. But I think the fact that he had these, and I think did he have the Bible?
Yes.
From which, so he's got the sources. He's looking for competent chaps to do what he wishes, and this is what you must copy. So Smith is the key person here, as with the building, and he's dependent on competent, good artisans to carry out the wishes. I think that's probably one end of the spectrum. At the other end, the artisans come with the engravings and do more or less what is fashionable in the space. The other thing, I think, to my mind, makes these paintings stand out, and it comes from the patron again, is that while Hezekiah, painted as a story in a deep frieze above panelling, is a very common way of telling a story in plaster or paint, and is mainstream. I'm not sure whether the Carpenter's Hall paintings were similarly. I think they are. The difference with these is the scale. He's painting the whole wall from floor to ceiling, about 4 meters, 4.5, something like that. And the whole of 2 floors of the house is painted thus. We've got fragments from almost everywhere. And I can't think of another example of domestic painting on that scale before the 17th century, where whole rooms are painted from Chloe. Maybe there are other English examples. It's that scale, isn't it?
And the subject matter as well. I think 9 times out of 10. 9 times out of 10, the room we decorated in the 1560s and 1570s with Old Testament subject matter. So it's the classical references to which are unique.
Still questions? Yes. So, and then we'll come back to people who have spoken before.
I'm more interested to know that house in Antwerp, which is very small. Maybe it's just his office, but there's a sort of difference between this. But of course, he's a wonderful patron of the arts, and quite a very lovely paintings we've seen.
Okay, so would anybody like to?
He only had one son, the John Smith, who was very sad to really deceased him. The major request that he made was that was actually the books that he left to his college, to Queen's College, which he still had. The major part of the rest of his work was actually to use his gold chains and everything that they could lay his hands on and finish building his house.
You say, what sort of luxury? Well, in my naive way, I rather assume that that Smith has in mind the recreation of a Roman villa, as described by Pliny, and that would be quite a strong sort of impetus to recreate something from the classical past. And that, I don't know whether it's decorum or luxury, but surely that's a big element, isn't it?
Yes, that's absolutely right. That is exactly what I was really arguing this morning, that this is Smith saying, my house is a Roman, my new house is a Roman house. And then, of course, we actually have to remember that we're again addressing his reading of the whole Roman discussion of ethics and the ethical building, and why it's actually really wrong to use inappropriate materials inappropriately. And so I think it's actually very important that this is paint. And I think that's one of the ways in which it isn't excessive, because paint is not gold.
Yes.
For example.
One or two more questions. Jean, you were... Thank you.
Thank you. This is a general point from the discussion throughout the day. We talk of and think of the Sunset Circle as the springboard of intellectual and artistic achievement in the mid-century. I wonder if it might not be more appropriate to talk about the Dudley or Northumberland Circle. If you look at who is connected to whom, I know Smith is connected to Somerset, but the artistic impulse certainly goes on far more in the Dudley line than it does in the Seymour.
Right, yes, okay. Andrew, did you really like Claire to speak? That's good.
Sorry, just thinking about in Parkinson's Hall particularly, it's not really exemplary. There are just images from the Bible that have carpentry connections, so building the ark. But the one that is surprising, I think, is that Christ in his Father's School, the carpenter's workshop. Then you have a New Testament scene actually depicting Christ, and I wonder whether that was a reason why they were covered up quite soon. But again, I'm not sure you can think of company halls as public spaces that need that kind of exemplary thing. I mean, they are public to the members, but membership is quite limited.
Yes, but I'm using public there in a sense of it's about your public duty. That's the sense of it. As a company member, as you know, the Scuola Venice Commission, these things, you go in and you're reminded on a daily basis, just as much of what Tara's talked about in the household being encouraging daily prayer by the very presence of religious iconography in your house, however selective it is post-Reformation. In company halls, you're reminded every time you go in there that you are a member of a company which has certain duties to each other and therefore to the public. So it's that sense of, and I think this is one of the things we're trying to talk about here, isn't it, about Smith and the sense of public duty that you might feel? Yes, or civic, whatever. Yeah.
But I think also the carpenters is partly boosting their own self-image.
Yes. Yes, by all means.
As a later on towards the ending, I thought I'd introduce a negative and hopefully provocative element to our discussion. I was very struck by Andrew said about part of the views, he was not at all well known soon after his death because he did so many things. He didn't particularly perhaps excel at anything like that. Not relating very well what he said, but is that indeed what we think of him as a scholar, that he was indeed a jack of all trades and a master of none?
Well, there is some interest in the law, but I mean it's kind of it's a strange, you know, it's written sort of 25-30 years before it's published, isn't it? And it's a strangely kind of anachronistic text when it actually gets out there. It's not something that's there's something always belated or always slightly out of time in the way his reputation works. I don't know enough about the history of Hill Hall to know about its particular influence. I mean, I'll probably answer that more successfully than I can. But I think people are sometimes subject to the vagaries of fashion. It's and if you don't have that sort of successful coterie of disciples, often your reputation can become very, very obscure. You can see it in terms of, I'm thinking because I was working in literature, there are certain poets who are frustratingly individual and don't really have a sort of series of followers, and so they kind of, what they do ends up kind of seeming like an end in itself sometimes. I sometimes think it's it's an accident of literary or intellectual history that these things happen sometimes. I don't know if there's necessarily a terribly profound reason. I think it's just probably sort of bound up.
I think I'll call it to a close there. I think all our people, our speakers, and you deserve a drink. I will leave Richard to close the proceedings, but can I say, just from the society's point of view, do come back and see us. There are many fellows here, but those of you who are not, you're very welcome to our 5 o'clock lectures. The leaflets for next term are in the hall already?
There, yep, in the entrance hall.
In the entrance hall. We also have public lectures. We're trying to people here have already given for us in our series to bring wide audiences to this institution. And I've said to one or two people today, I'm standing here so I can say this, can't I? All serious scholars are welcome to use our library. It's very important that that's open. That's what we want to happen here. Thank you so much on behalf of the Society for coming today. But I'll leave Richard to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank you for sharing our last discussion. All I wanted to say really was a really profound thank you to everybody who's been here, everybody who's joined in with your questions and contributions. But I particularly want to thank the friends who have chaired sessions today, but also contributors, all of whom have come up with new things to say. And whether or not we've achieved greater focus, we've certainly achieved a very interesting exploration of a very, very remarkable, if I may say, singular character, Sir Thomas Smith. Thank you all very much indeed.